Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Ayman Nazir and welcome to Knowledge Realm. So students, in the previous lecture we studied liberalism, one of the most dominant theories of the world, and we ended the lecture with the two types of liberalism, that is idealism and new liberalism. We know that in 19th century the main philosophy, liberalism, got divided into two, that is idealism and liberalism. So today we would study in detail the concept of idealism, who proposed this, and what happened at the time in the world, and what were the events that led to the invention of idealism. So we would discuss this in detail. So stay focused and let's get started. So idealism came into being after World War I. It was the dominant philosophy of international relations after World War I. But why? Because leaders of the world were finding ways to eradicate the menace of war from the world. We all know that World War I was a kind of war that the world had never seen before this war. It was a world war, and it was an unprecedented war. More than 5 million people died in this war, and now leaders were interested in finding ways to eradicate war from the world for good. They did not want anything like that happen again in the world, and they were just trying to find ways to eradicate this menace from the world, and they were just trying to find ways so that wars like this never happen again. So they invented a new subject, that is international relations. We have studied this in the birth and evolution of international relations lecture, that international relations came into being after World War I. It was born from the ashes of war. So the leaders, they invented this new subject, international relations, and started studying war. The main aim of international relations was studying war and trying to find the ways to prevent war. So Woodrow Wilson, he presented idealism. Idealism was backed by the liberal philosophy of Enlightenment era. Idealism is actually a kind of philosophy that was backed by the liberal philosophy, and we have studied this liberal philosophy in the previous lecture. We have studied this in detail. We have studied the concept of John Locke and the core assumptions of liberalism, everything. We have studied this. So idealism actually came into being, and it is an offshoot of liberalism. It was backed by the liberal philosophy of Enlightenment era. The main proponent, I mentioned it, the main proponent was American President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson gave 14 points, and since Woodrow Wilson was the proponent of this idealism concept, this concept is also known as Wilsonian idealism. So this was the brief introduction of idealism. Since I have mentioned of 14 points of Woodrow Wilson, we should study these points and try to understand that how the idealism presented by Woodrow Wilson was based on the liberal philosophy of Enlightenment era. So on January 8, 1918, Woodrow Wilson gave a very famous speech in the Congress of America, and there he presented these 14 points. So we should study these points, not all points, we would study the main points to understand that how the philosophy of Woodrow Wilson, the Wilsonian idealism, was based on the liberal philosophy of Enlightenment era. So first of all, Woodrow Wilson asserted open diplomacy. He believed that there should be transparent negotiations and open diplomacy between nations. There should be no secret treaties and alliances. Why? Because these secret treaties and alliances, these things create conflict, and these things lead to war. For example, World War I. In World War I, Austria-Hungary and Germany, these two states, empires, were in alliance, and Russia and France, these two states were in alliance, and there were secret treaties and alliances, and diplomacy was not open. No one knew who is friend, who is rival. So Woodrow Wilson advocated open diplomacy. Then, second point, freedom of the seas. Freedom of navigation on seas for all nations in times of peace and war. Woodrow Wilson advocated this freedom of the seas. Woodrow Wilson believed that seas should be free. Seas should not be property of a single nation. A nation that adjoins a sea should not behave like that. This is my property and I would not let any other state pass this sea, and I would not let use anyone this sea. So there should be freedom of the seas, because this thing would promote peace in the world. And we all know that all the import takes place by sea routes. So Woodrow Wilson advocated this for the betterment of all the nations of the world. Then free trade. There should be no barriers of trade, and trade should be free between nations. It would promote fair economic competition and cooperation among nations. I've explained this concept of free trade in the lecture on liberalism, and we all know that how this free trade unite people, and how this free trade is actually a medicine of war. Because when people get united by the help of trade, when people know that I trade billions of worth of goods from my rival state, I would never ever wage war on that state, because I would never want economic loss to my state. So free trade is actually a medicine for war. So Woodrow Wilson advocated free trade. Woodrow Wilson asserted that there should be free trade between nations so that nations are united and nations do not go to war. Then disarmament. Woodrow Wilson urged this thing that nations should reduce their weapons and military forces to decrease the prospects of war, to eliminate the prospects of war. Woodrow Wilson say that when countries try to increase their military power, they are very likely to go to war. They are very likely to wage war on their rival, because they know that we have military power, we are strong, and we can wage war on a rival anytime we want. So there should be disarmament, and countries should reduce their weapons and military forces. And this thing, one more important point here, this thing actually inculcates a fear in the rival. For example, if today US try to increase its military power, this thing would create a fear in China. And similarly, China would also increase its military power, because it knows that its rival is increasing its military power and it is preparing for a war. At any time, it can wage a war. So this thing leads to a security dilemma. So Woodrow Wilson advocated the disarmament. Woodrow Wilson believed that states should reduce their weapons to promote peace in the world and to eliminate war. Then, right of self-determination. Colonial nations should be granted their own sovereign nations. Woodrow Wilson was a proponent of decolonization. He did not like colonization, and he believed that all the nations in the world should be granted with the right of self-determination, and all the nations should be given their own sovereign states, and there should be a wave of decolonization in the world. Then sovereignty of the invaded territories should be restored. Belgium was invaded at that time, France was invaded at that time. So Woodrow Wilson spoke in favor of those invaded territories, and he believed that territories that were invaded in World War I should be evacuated, and the sovereignty of these nations should be restored. Then equality of all nations. Woodrow Wilson advocated this thing, equality of all nations. Woodrow Wilson said that all nations should be treated equally, irrespective of their size, irrespective of their area, irrespective of their economic, military strength, irrespective of everything. Nations should be treated equally. Then the last point, international institution. Woodrow Wilson was the first person to give this idea of international institutions. Woodrow Wilson proposed that there should be an international governmental organization to resolve the conflicts among nations so that the war is eliminated from the world. And we all know then League of Nations was established, but it could not perform well. But still, Woodrow Wilson gave this idea, and today we all know that it is the idea of Woodrow Wilson that we have United Nations. So all these points were given by Woodrow Wilson, and if we try to analyze these points, we would realize that these points are actually based on the liberal philosophy of Enlightenment era. And all these points are actually trying to create peace in the world and elimination of war, because war was the main problem at that time. After World War I, all the leaders wanted elimination of this threat of war from the world. So Woodrow Wilson gave these points, and what do these points promise? Elimination of war. So I hope that all of you now understand. So we have studied the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson. Now we should study that what were the efforts made by the idealist to remove the threat of war from the world. And studying these, you would realize that all these efforts were actually based on the liberal philosophy of Enlightenment era. So first of all, liberal international institutions. Woodrow Wilson, he gave this idea, and all the idealists, they established a liberal international institutions to resolve the conflict between the nations so that the war is prevented, and they established League of Nations. This was the first liberal international institution, the international governmental organization. We all know this. It could not work very well and it failed, but still it was the first try, and we know that today the United Nations that we have, it is based on the idea presented by Woodrow Wilson. Then democratic peace theory and right of self-determination. This was the second effort. The idealist advocated that people of Austro-Hungarian Empire should be given freedom and their own sovereign state. Then collective security. Now this was the idea given by Woodrow Wilson. Aggressive states should be checked collectively under the aegis of international institutions. We know that this was one of the task and responsibility of League of Nations. All the nations got united under the aegis of this international institution, and they pledged that they would come to forefront if there is any aggressive state, and they would collectively try to protect the victim state, and they would collectively try to prevent the aggressive state from doing any harm to the victim state. And this was the concept of collective security, and this is actually based on the liberal philosophy. Then disarmament. Once again, this idea was given by Woodrow Wilson. Countries should disarm themselves to prevent war and promote peace in the world. Then the last one, and the most important one, free trade. Trade would create friendly relations between states and people would not resort to war. So these were the efforts of idealists to remove war from the world. So we have studied idealism. What is idealism? Who proposed this? And what were the efforts of idealist scholars in prevention of war? But students, idealism could not perform very well, and it failed. It failed in 1939. Idealism's main task was the prevention of war. But in 1939, the world saw the initiation of an even worse and brutal war, that is World War II. In 1939, Hitler started World War II. Now this thing announced the failure of idealism. World War II was many times brutal than World War I. Studies show that almost 50 million people died in World War II. Then on April 19, 1946, League of Nations was also dissolved. So we can say that yes, idealism failed because idealism's main task was the prevention of war, but it could not prevent war. Rather, it gave way to an even worse war, that is World War II. So this thing announced the failure of idealism, and this thing triggered a debate, that is first great debate. Now this was the debate between realist scholars and idealist scholars. Idealist scholars had failed in fulfilling their task, that is prevention of war. They had failed. So realist scholars came to the forefront, and the world saw a revival of realism then. But there is another separate topic, first great debate, that is debate between realism and idealism. We would not discuss that here. I think we have studied a lot for today. Inshallah, in the next lecture, we would discuss the topic first great debate, that is realism versus idealism. So, thank you so much for today. Thank you for listening to me and this topic. I hope that it is now very clear. Uh, don't forget to like this video, comment on this video, share, and subscribe the channel Knowledge Realm.